Hi everybody, it's Comic Crack, and we're back with an old time video from this channel. Something that's been happening more recently is numerous amount of haul type videos. The past year has yielded a hell of a lot of Underground Comics for those of you following the channel. Now that I've kind of got through a good chunk of them, I'm taking a break from trying to take a break from searching online for more Underground Comics deals and continuing reading, especially with this last haul that I got, which was the 70 books, which a bunch I had to throw away. I have a lot of reading to do, which I have been throughout the year, and I think now it's time to start talking about some of my favorites. One of the things that I do get asked quite a bit about are just recommendations. So maybe it's time to highlight some of my favorites. For this first video, instead of highlighting a favorite book, I wanted to highlight a favorite artist that has appeared for me throughout my digging of these undergrounds. Jaxon will be who we're talking about today, who just goes by the name Jaxon for the most part, Jaxon. When I was looking recently just for more of his work to see what was out there, especially what was collected, one of the things that came up was this issue of the Comics Journal. This is issue number 61, and it's winter of 1981. And there's a fantastic interview with Jaxon, an interview with the creator of Comanche Moon. And in that issue, they also reference issue number 46, which just has a review of the Comanche Moon comic. Just the single issue, I believe. I don't think they talk about the whole. It's 3 issues total. Oh, sorry, no, Comanche Moon. I'm sorry. Comanche Moon says right there. So that's the collection, and the collection is the 3 books, which is White Comanche, Blood on the Moon, which I don't actually have, and Red Raider. I've read them digitally, and they're fantastic books. They're more historical based, which is what his work turned into down the line. And I prefer the later Jaxon than to the earlier stuff. Not that the early stuff is bad by any stretch. It's just I really like the fact that he full-on went into the history of Texas, where he was from, and just got some of these stories out there. Anyway, so if you have a stack of Comics Journal yourself, look for issue number 61 and give that a read. It's a really good overview of his career, where he started, where he was going, and even kind of talks a little bit about what he wants to do in the future, which I'll get to when we get to that part. So, those aside, I pulled out the Comics Underground Revolution book by Des Skin. Unfortunately, with some of these lesser known artists, and by lesser known, it's not meant in any way other than they're just not talked about a lot. You hear a ton about guys like Robert Crumb. You hear a lot about Wonder Warthog and Furry Freak Brothers, etc. Some of these other guys you just don't hear about a lot unless you're into the comics themselves. And it's the same in this book. They do mention him a number of times, but by no stretch is it kind of a deep history of the man himself. And from something like this, which is more an overview of Underground Comics, I wouldn't necessarily expect an in-depth kind of look at each and every artist. So it gives you a nice little taste of who he was. As with anything, and I've talked about it on this channel before, specifically when Damien and I talked about the First Kingdom, the supposed first graphic novel. Will Eisner supposedly had the first graphic novel. So-and-so supposedly had the first graphic novel. So-and-so was supposedly the inventor of this, that, and the other thing. Jaxon kind of falls in that category as far as Underground Comix work goes. He created this God Knows character in 1963, according to here. I think in the book they say 1964. I'd have to double check that, but according to the About the Author, 1963 is when he first drew God Knows. Over the years, he came to be friends with guys like Gilbert Shelton, Fred Todd, and David Moriarty. They were kind of called the Austin Mafia. They were all from Austin, Texas. In 1969, they started Ripoff Press. They decided that they would buy a printing press and start printing off comics themselves. One of the first comics that they did wasn't this, but one of the first comics they did was a God Knows comic. And I think what differentiated it from other stuff that had come out at the time, it wasn't a collection of strips that had appeared in underground newspapers. It was something that was created solely for the Ripoff Press to be a comic, a standalone comic. So he's one of the guys, along with Frank Stack, a.k.a. Fulbert Sturgeon, who I think is kind of a little more credit as the first guy to be an underground artist, so-called underground comics artist. That's what's considered being the first, not necessarily a reprinting of strips, doing all original material that had a first appearance. Anyway, this is a book that I've had with me since the 80s. I think it said 1988 inside here. Yes, copyright 1988 is this collection. Whatever printing this happens to be, it doesn't say in here. I haven't looked it up. I don't know how many printings of this specific issue there were, but I probably would have bought this around the time, maybe a year or two later anyway. I read it at the time, and then it's sat and followed me around the country for the rest of my life. Opening it here for this video is the first time I've opened it in at least a decade, maybe even more. And it's nothing that just really struck me at the time as something that I was interested in. When I was discovering these undergrounds, as I've said many times before, I was exactly the same, probably like a lot of people. I really liked Robert Crumb. I really liked the Freak Brothers, and at the time there was Pete Bagg was coming out with stuff. Daniel Clowes was coming out with stuff. So I was reading a lot of the second wave, I guess, for lack of a better term, of underground comics artists or alternative comics artists. Pardon me. So this wasn't something that really stuck with me. I couldn't even tell you what the strips were about. Something has me thinking they were sort of along the lines of a Mr. Natural type of character. Not that that would have been a reference for him by any stretch. One of the things you can see is a pretty basic style. Very basic line drawings. For the most part, no borders. Even though you can still get a sense of where the borders would be. It's not like the page is a mess with things that you're kind of weaving your way through. They're still divided up to some degree. Even if stuff like this does get a little text heavy and not, it's still not confusing to follow the story. Still recognizable as Jackson's art, but a very, very, very stripped down version of his art, as you'll see as we get further into it. So from there, I go, and again, I obviously don't have everything that he's done, but just some examples that I pulled out from the back issues. Skull Comics was one of those anthologies that started into the Underground Comics artists' love for old EC horror titles, as you can see from the cover there. An Exor Psychic comic is what they call them, and the EC symbol appears on a lot of the issues, if not all of the issues. It also was something where H.P. Lovecraft became a big influence for a lot of these artists, and they took a lot of cues from Lovecraft stories. The last two issues of Skull Comics specifically are just 3, 4, and 5. Let me just see. Sorry. Yes, issue 4 and 5 were Lovecraft issues. Jaxon was also one of the people that was editing and compiling these comics as well. So not only contributing to them, but also kind of one of the editors and making sure that things were a little consistent. And because all of these guys were such close friends, I think a lot of them shared space together, so they would get direct influence from each other. The original intent, from how I understand it again, of this Lovecraft issue number 4 was that it was supposed to only be one issue, but because they kept bouncing ideas back and forth amongst the group of them, it spread out into 2 issues. And then further to that point, guys like Richard Corbin really took the Lovecraft influence a step further and did many, many, many books based on Lovecraft stories. But it all started with Skull Comics here. And as for his style, we'll have a quick flip through here. You can see a slight change when we get to it. Let me check the year first here before we get too far. It's been so long. 1970. It's been so long since I've done a video using one hand. It's a challenge, to say the least. So here we go. So a story called The Intruder. And again, you can see a little more of a basic style. And again, I'm not using basic in any sort of derogatory way. It's just the way that it is. A little more simple lines, although the backgrounds of here, you can see things that are starting to get a little more detailed. Even some of the faces are starting to get a little more detailed as well. He stepped out of doing any sort of art for a while, and like a lot of people, influenced by Robert Crumb and the success of Zap Comics, and that kind of gave him a kick in the ass. There was a number of years where he went to Hawaii and apparently smoked a lot of weed, and started carrying around his sketchbook again with him. And then upon returning, saw Zap Comics and saw Robert Crumb's stuff and went, holy shit, this is the kind of stuff that we can be doing, and kind of used that as a jumping off point again. So, I mean, there's never any doubt that guys like Crumb and Zap were not in a hugely important figure and group to Underground Comics as a whole. So, again, starting to see a little more detail, but not to the extent that we'll see right away. But before we get to that, one of the things that I do want to briefly talk about, and I'm going to keep it brief, and it's one of the things, it's more a link within the story than something I want to focus on, and thankfully he didn't focus on too much. There's a story in Slow Death number 7 here. Each of the Slow Death series, as it kind of went on, focused on a particular topic. It started off being more ecological type horror. This particular issue was the special issue True War Tales. And again, those of you that are maybe more squeamish, this might be the time that you want to skip ahead on the video and bypass this particular chunk. It's something that's talked about in the Comics Journal article as well. This Nits Make Lice is what it's called, and this is from 1976, 1977, but he signed it from 1975. This Nits Make Lice is something where he wanted to move away from pure fiction and wanted to get into more historical fiction, writing about the world as it was, specifically in Texas. And this one, he really went all out and presented a horrific story in really brutal detail, without pulling any punches. As not quite an experiment, but it was an early attempt at doing this type of work, and admits in the article that it was maybe a little too far. It really was an assault on the reader, and he realized the limitations of continuing on that route and didn't do anything else like it. So basically about a group of soldiers going and massacring a group of indigenous peoples. And again, this one panel here says it all as he's talking to his one of his captains. That's what we're here for. I've got 600 men with me, and their enlistments are up real soon. Till now, we're the laughing stock of the territory. The bloodless third, they call us. Well, not anymore. We're going to start wading in gore, right, Major? And wade in gore they do. They go and find this group of indigenous people and mow them down, basically, much to the surprise of the people themselves, who have been given an American flag as a show of, you're our friends, not our enemies. And they gather under the flag thinking, don't worry about it, they're not going to hurt us, don't even sweat it, not knowing that these people are just fucking savages, and they're going to start killing them. And they're going to start killing them, and they're going to start taking some trophies, and taking some trophies, and taking some trophies, and just doing all sorts of absolutely fucking horrific things. If anybody has seen The Revenant, it's one of the things that this group of guys that I bowl with, what we really loved about the film was that it showed that time in history unflinchingly. It showed that time as they were fucking animals, and some of the shit that happened was just absolutely brutal. And it was done in just the most disturbing fashion that it could be. And that's one of the things that really impressed us about the movie, was that they decided to show that time as it was. And not try to sugarcoat things, and not try to just gloss over the horror of it. And that to me is something that this hits right on the head as well. This is really showing the horrors of a scenario like this. And again, him realizing that maybe this wasn't the best way to approach the topic, but using this as a jumping off point for some more of his later stories. My battery's going to die here, so I'm going to cut right here, and I'll be back to kind of wrap up this chunk of the Jack Jaxon story.